She had been told to expect cruelty. A young Japanese nurse, barely 22, stepped off the transport truck into the glaring Texas sunlight. Around her, other captured auxiliaries clutched their thin satchels, eyes darting toward the tall American sentries at the gates. Her heart pounded. Propaganda had taught her that the Americans were undisciplined, predatory men who would see captured women as spoils. She braced for shouting, shoving, or worse. Instead, the guards stood silently at attention. They were tall, well-fed, their uniforms crisp, rifles held upright. Their faces gave away nothing but routine. An officer stepped forward with an interpreter. "Form 2 lines," the interpreter barked in Japanese. No insults, no leers, only instructions. The prisoners obeyed, but their minds reeled. Where were the catcalls, the gloating, the humiliation? Why did these men act as though this was a job, not a conquest? Inside the intake tent, medics waited with clipboards. Each woman's name, age, and unit were recorded. Identification tags were issued. Rules were explained. No fraternization, no special favors, no exceptions. The interpreter repeated the camp's policy carefully in Japanese. American soldiers may not approach prisoners outside their duties. Personal contact is forbidden. This is the Geneva Convention. The words landed like a shockwave. Some women exchanged glances. They had expected unwanted attention, perhaps even bribes or coercion. Instead, they were being told the opposite, an iron wall of rules separating them from the guards. As medical staff inspected their wounds, the professionalism continued. Bandages applied quickly, temperatures taken, vaccination records checked. No lingering touch, no unnecessary questions. The young nurse sat stiffly on a bench as an American medic wrapped her wrist. He wore gloves, spoke through an interpreter, and moved on to the next patient without a glance. This wasn't coldness born of contempt. It was coldness born of procedure, the kind of detached courtesy she had never imagined from the enemy. At the far end of the tent, a large sign in both English and Japanese read, "No personal contact between U.S. personnel and prisoners. All requests must go through Camp Command." She stared at the sign, trying to reconcile it with the stories she'd been told back home. It was not indulgence. It was not cruelty. It was a refusal to cross a line she had assumed didn't exist. As she followed the line toward the barracks, the realization grew. Whatever this place was, it was governed by rules stronger than rumor. And that was more disorienting than any insult could have been. The barracks were plain wooden buildings set in neat rows behind barbed wire. Inside, sunlight slanted through high windows, catching the edges of metal bunks lined with thin mattresses. The women entered hesitantly, expecting a cell-like atmosphere. Instead, they found order. Beds arranged, blankets folded, lockers marked with numbers, and rules posted in both English and Japanese. 2 female interpreters, WAC volunteers, stood ready to explain camp regulations. They handed out uniforms, towels, and a printed list of daily schedules. Breakfast at 600. Roll call at 700. Lights out at 900. No unauthorized contact with guards, the sheet read. Each line reinforced the same message: boundaries, discipline, predictability. At first, the women whispered among themselves. Some had believed American guards would try to barter favors for kindness. Others had imagined nighttime inspections and whispered threats. None of it came. The guards outside walked their patrol routes like clockwork. Inside the barracks, no soldier entered without permission from a female interpreter. Meals arrived on trays wheeled in by kitchen staff, not by guards. When a woman spilled her soup in nervousness, a civilian worker handed her another without comment. The young nurse sat on her bunk, clutching the printed regulations. "This is impossible," she murmured in Japanese. "They treat us like hospital patients." Yet the tension didn't disappear overnight. Some prisoners still suspected a hidden motive. Was this all an act to lure them into complacency? But the days began to establish a pattern. Inspections were brief and impersonal. Supplies were issued at the same time each week. Medical checkups were routine and conducted by female staff where possible. Not once did a guard cross the line of professionalism. Their faces were polite but unreadable, as though wearing invisible masks of discipline. One evening, a guard walked past while the women were airing laundry. He averted his gaze entirely, eyes fixed on the horizon. The gesture stunned them more than a stare would have. The young nurse wrote in her diary, "They do not look at us. They do not speak unless duty requires. It is as if we are invisible, except for the paperwork." This realization struck harder than cruelty would have. They were captives, yes, but also subjects of a system that refused to blur boundaries, and for women raised to expect the opposite, that rejection was its own kind of shock. Days passed, and the rhythms of camp life became almost mechanical. Each morning at roll call, the women lined up, counted off, and returned to their barracks without incident. The predictability began to erode their fear. No night raids, no intrusive inspections, no secret punishments. Instead, order, paperwork, and schedules. A bulletin board appeared near the mess hall with notices in English and Japanese. It listed work details, mail schedules, and a small sign. "Questions? Ask the interpreter." It was there the young nurse first saw an American guard kneeling to adjust the bootlace of a prisoner who had fallen. He didn't touch her otherwise, didn't even speak, just helped her rise and stepped back. The act was startling in its simplicity. He didn't smile. He didn't linger. He performed a duty and returned to his post. Some prisoners began to realize the guards were following a system. Strict rules that applied even to kindness. Help was given as a matter of policy, not personal favor. When mail call arrived, the women were handed blank stationery and told they could write to families. This, too, came with rules. No personal details about the camp layout. No hidden messages. Every letter censored. Still, the mere possibility of writing home felt like a crack in the wall. The nurse stared at the paper for a long time before writing simply, "I'm alive." They treat us by rules around her. Other women wrote similar notes, their hands trembling as though afraid the act itself might be punished. But no punishment came. Gradually, a strange new emotion surfaced. Relief. These soldiers were not friends, but they were not predators either. One evening, as the sun lowered behind the barbed wire, the prisoners noticed the guards retreating to their own quarters rather than lingering. The boundary was absolute. The young nurse whispered to her bunkmate, "They will not cross the line." "It is like a wall of glass between us." Her bunkmate nodded, still unsure whether to feel safer or more unsettled. The idea of American soldiers rejecting even simple camaraderie challenged everything they had been taught about the enemy. It was not indulgence. It was discipline. And within that discipline lay an unexpected dignity, a strange form of respect born from refusal. The camp's rulebook became almost as familiar to the prisoners as their own memories. It was read aloud twice a week by an interpreter, its pages dog-eared from constant reference. No gifts, no favors, no conversations beyond duty. The words were drilled into both guards and prisoners. At first, it sounded like a barrier. Over time, it began to sound like protection. In the barracks, whispers turned to cautious discussions. Women wondered why American soldiers acted so rigidly. Was it fear? Was it contempt? or something else entirely. The young nurse overheard two guards outside one evening. They spoke in low English, but the interpreter later explained, "Fraternization with POWs is forbidden. Court-martial for anyone who breaks it." That revelation spread like wildfire among the women. This was not just politeness, it was law. The Americans had bound themselves to rules as tightly as the prisoners were bound to fences. At meals, the separation was obvious. Guards ate at their own tables far away, their backs turned. Prisoners lined up under the watch of civilian staff, served and returned to their seats without a single word exchanged. One afternoon, a small group of women tried to offer hand-sewn armbands to a guard as thanks for medical supplies. He refused immediately, stepping back and signaling to the interpreter to explain the policy again. The refusal left them stunned. In their world, gifts were a way to build obligation, to secure protection. Here, it was meaningless. For the first time, the women began to see the Americans not as potential tormentors or potential allies, but as functionaries of an enormous system. The young nurse began writing in her diary, "Their rejection is like steel. They neither hate nor desire us. They simply do their work and vanish." This rejection produced a curious effect. Instead of feeling preyed upon, the women began to feel safe. Safe inside walls of discipline they did not understand but could begin to predict. At night, the camp fell into quiet. Guards patrolled silently. Lights dimmed at the same hour. Even the footsteps of the sentries marked time like a metronome. It was in that steadiness that fear started to ebb. They still mistrusted, still doubted, but the rhythm of refusal created a strange sense of order. What had been rumors back home of American soldiers leering, shouting, or worse, began to crumble. The myth of dishonor on capture dissolved not through kindness, but through structure. By the third week, the camp's routines had become second nature. Morning roll call, work assignments, meals, inspections. Yet beneath the surface, a new tension flickered. The women had adjusted to food, beds, and clean clothes, but their minds struggled to fit this new reality. Some had begun to test the edges of the rules, curious about the men who guarded them. The young nurse noticed how one of the guards always paused near the infirmary. He didn't speak, didn't stare, but his presence lingered like an unanswered question. She wondered if he might someday speak beyond orders, or if his silence was permanent. One afternoon, she deliberately thanked him in broken English for delivering bandages. He only nodded once and walked away. This rejection startled her more than cruelty would have. It was clean, impersonal, unassailable. Across the barracks, whispers grew. Some women speculated the Americans were forbidden by their own officers. Others insisted the guards were merely waiting for the right moment to reveal their true nature. But the truth remained the same. Day after day, no lines were crossed. When guards delivered supplies, they did so through interpreters. When injuries occurred, female medics handled them. The pattern began to create a paradox. The women, once terrified of assault, now found themselves wondering why the soldiers stayed so distant. At meals, the prisoners could see the guards laughing among themselves, but never with the captives. The separation was a wall of silence, built from orders and military law. For women raised in a culture where power often blurred into control, this deliberate separation felt alien. "They are like shadows with rifles," one whispered. The young nurse wrote in her diary, "I expected monsters. Instead, I found ghosts of discipline." The phrase spread quietly through the barracks like a secret code. Yet even as distance defined their interactions, the prisoners began to sense something else, a kind of reluctant respect. The Americans' refusal seemed less like contempt than like restraint. Some women admitted privately that this restraint felt safer than any kindness could. Better a wall, one said, than a trap. Heads nodded around her bunk. And so the camp settled into its new normal. No intimacy, no favors, but no violations either. The shock of capture had faded into a muted astonishment at being treated according to rules. By the fourth week, the camp authorities expanded the mail program. Each woman was allowed to write one letter every 2 weeks, inspected but otherwise unaltered. Stacks of envelopes appeared on the mess tables. The interpreter explained how to address them, how to sign names in both languages. The act felt ceremonial, like being momentarily reconnected to another world. The young nurse stared at her blank page. For a long moment, she couldn't decide what to say. Then she wrote simply, "I am alive." They treat us with rules around her. Other women scribbled similar notes, each letter a small confession, to families still under rationing and propaganda. The mail gave the camp a new kind of energy. Women traded paper for pencils, asked interpreters how to phrase sentences, even dared to describe the meals or the medical care they received. Yet they also hesitated. Some letters were torn up and rewritten after second thoughts. Would their families believe them? Would censors delete their words? One evening, the interpreter returned with replies, short, faintly written, smuggled across oceans. Some of the women cried silently, clutching the envelopes to their chests. In those replies were questions. Is it true? Are you really alive? Do they feed you? For the first time, the women saw how captivity could carry not only shame, but relief for loved ones. The nurse noticed her own tone changing. She no longer wrote only about fear or confusion. She wrote about routine, about learning a few English words, about the quietness of the nights. And she noticed something else, how the Americans enforced the letter rules as strictly as everything else. No personal notes to guards, no thank you gifts included. The separation was complete. This refusal to blur lines between captor and captive created a strange respect. The Americans did not try to win hearts, only to follow regulations. The women began to understand that the guards' rejection of familiarity was not an insult, but a system designed to keep both sides from crossing a line that could not be uncrossed. At night, reading her letter back to herself, the nurse wrote in her diary, "They will not accept gifts, nor kindness, nor closeness. Perhaps that is why I can sleep." For the first time since her capture, she fell asleep before lights out, her breathing steady, no longer waiting for some unseen cruelty. By midsummer, the camp had settled into an almost mechanical rhythm. Wake-up call at dawn, breakfast, assigned work, mail hour, lights out. The fear of early days had faded into a cautious routine. The women began to organize themselves inside the barracks. Some took on cleaning duties. Others taught basic writing to those who had never learned. Even in captivity, small hierarchies and friendships emerged. They still expected the rules to break at any moment. Yet the American soldiers never did. They kept their distance, always polite, always firm. It was discipline transformed into a daily wall. One morning, the young nurse watched a guard issue orders to a group of new prisoners. His tone was clipped, but not cruel. He pointed to the rules posted on the wall, then stepped back, leaving the interpreter to handle details. She realized she had not seen a guard raise his voice in weeks. Not one slap, not one threat. Instead, everything was done through procedure. This consistency eroded her reflexive fear. "They are not unpredictable," she wrote in her diary. "They are like clocks with rifles." Some women found the routine unbearable. Others found it strangely comforting. After months of war and chaos, the predictability of the Americans felt like a strange kind of safety net. In the evenings, the guards would rotate patrols. Women sat on their bunks, reading donated books, humming tunes, or sewing. The low murmur of American voices outside became background noise, no longer a threat. Letters continued to arrive from Japan. Some brought hope, others brought heartbreak. But each letter made the women feel anchored to their past, even as their present reshaped their beliefs. And with each passing day, they saw how firmly the Americans separated duty from sentiment. No favors, no contact, no special treatment, even for the sick beyond medical care. The nurse began to see the guards differently. They were not cruel men holding power over captives. They were soldiers obeying a code that left little room for abuse, but also little room for connection. It was a paradox she still struggled to reconcile. How could people so careful, so disciplined, also be the enemy in whose name bombs fell on cities she had known? She started sketching the camp in a small notebook. Rows of barracks, towers, the barbed wire. She drew the guards as tall silhouettes, faceless but orderly, like pillars of some invisible architecture. It was in these sketches that she began to understand her own transformation. The drawings were no longer filled with fear. They were diagrams of a system, not monsters. By the 5th week, a subtle transformation had taken hold inside the barracks. What began as disbelief had become reluctant acceptance. What began as fear had become a complicated kind of respect. The women began to talk openly at night about the guards, not with fear, but with curiosity. Why were they so restrained? Why did they act like machines of order rather than men of conquest? Some compared them to the officers they had known back home. Our commanders were visible, loud, one woman said. These ones disappear behind their rules. Heads nodded in the dim light. The nurse began to notice how even small gestures followed patterns. Guards stepping back after handing out supplies, refusing gifts, declining attempts at small talk beyond orders. It wasn't just the rules. It was a culture built on boundaries, a system where soldiers protected not only the captives but themselves from moral compromise. During afternoon work detail, the women cleaned the kitchen area while American MPS supervised from a distance. No harsh words, no pushing. When tasks were done, they were sent back to barracks with simple nods. For women raised in a military culture where hierarchy often blurred into humiliation, this impersonal consistency felt alien, yet it also felt secretly safer. At night, the nurse thought of her family and of Japan. She wondered what her brothers would say if they could see her now, fed, clothed, guarded by men who treated her with rules instead of fists. She found herself writing differently in her letters. Instead of fear, she wrote about routines. Instead of humiliation, she wrote about order. They do not treat us as enemies, she wrote. They treat us as obligations. The letters were censored, but still allowed through. Somewhere across the ocean, families read words that contradicted everything they had been told about American barbarity. Some women whispered that maybe this discipline was America's true strength, not weapons, but the ability to enforce boundaries even over prisoners. Others argued it was strategy, a way to collect intelligence or show off for propaganda. But even the skeptics admitted they felt less fear now than at any time since capture. The nurse began to feel an unexpected shift inside herself. The Americans' rejection of intimacy no longer felt like an insult. It felt like proof that she existed beyond being an object of war. In her diary, she wrote, "Their refusal is a strange kind of respect. I do not know why this feels like freedom." Late summer evenings in the camp brought a strange calm. Crickets outside the wire sang against the low hum of generators, and the sky above turned a deep red-orange before fading to black. Inside the barracks, women folded their blankets with a precision that mirrored the guards' routines. Even those who resisted at first now moved to the rhythm of the camp almost unconsciously. They had expected captivity to strip them of dignity. Instead, it was teaching them a different kind of discipline, one based not on fear, but on predictability. The nurse sat at her bunk, writing again. Her letters had grown longer. We are safe. They do not cross lines. We work. We eat. We live, she wrote in a careful hand. For the first time since the surrender, she began to plan for a future. Not a heroic escape or a glorious death, but a future with days that followed one another without terror. The guards, for their part, maintained their distance with iron consistency. No gifts, no personal questions, no favors beyond what regulations allowed. Some of the younger women had tried early on to test the boundaries with flirtations or compliments. Every time the guards responded the same way, stepping back, redirecting, or reporting the interaction to a superior. It wasn't cruelty. It was a refusal that left no ambiguity. The women began to understand that this, too, was policy. The Americans would not risk their code for sentiment. And strangely, this refusal began to feel like its own form of safety. They no longer feared being singled out or exploited. In rejecting closeness, the guards had made every woman equally invisible, and therefore equally protected. At night, the nurse remembered the officers she had served under in Japan. She remembered slaps, insults, long marches under fever, and the humiliation of being treated as expendable. The contrast was dizzying. She realized now that what she had once thought of as strength, cruelty, and arbitrary power was only another form of weakness. The Americans' restraint, frustrating as it was, demanded a stronger discipline than violence ever had. Some women whispered that perhaps this was why America was winning the war, not because of weapons, but because of systems and self-control. The idea felt dangerous to say aloud, yet it spread quietly. The nurse closed her diary. The guards' shadows passed along the outside of the barracks like clock hands. She no longer trembled at the sight of them. She still did not know how long captivity would last, or what waited beyond the wire. But she knew now, in a way she hadn't before, that she would survive it with her dignity intact. Autumn wind rattled the barbed wire, scattering dry leaves across the camp yard. The once harsh sunlight of midsummer had mellowed, and the days grew shorter. For the women inside the barracks, time itself felt different now. Not like a sentence, but like a season. The nurse watched the guards at morning roll call. Their uniforms were the same, their expressions the same, but she now understood the pattern. The meticulous checking of names, the exact spacing of steps, the deliberate way orders were delivered. It was all part of a structure designed to keep chaos at bay. She no longer mistook it for coldness. She saw it as the same discipline that kept them from exploiting her vulnerability. In her diary, she wrote, "At first, I feared their distance. Now I see it as a wall built to keep both sides safe. It is the strangest kindness I have known." Other women murmured similar thoughts. They had gone from dread to confusion, then to grudging acceptance, and now to something closer to relief. They could predict the guards' behavior, and in predictability they found an unexpected kind of freedom. One afternoon during the work detail in the garden, the women were given extra time to tend the plants they had sown. Small green shoots stood where bare dirt had been weeks before, a living metaphor for their own slow transformation. The guards stayed back, watching quietly. No shouts, no interruptions. The women worked in silence, feeling the sun on their faces, their hands in the soil. For a brief moment, the war seemed far away. The nurse thought of her mother again, of home, of a life beyond uniforms and salutes. She did not yet know if Japan would win or lose, but she did know that the world she had been raised to believe in had cracked. At night, the barracks smelled faintly of soap and dried leaves. Women whispered about what they would do after the war. Go back to nursing, open a small shop, or simply disappear into family life. They no longer whispered about dying with honor. The Americans' rejection of intimacy had done something her own army never could. It had forced her to see herself as a person, not just a function of a war machine. She realized that her identity no longer depended on how men saw her or how officers judged her worth. Her identity was built from the small acts of survival she performed each day, folding a blanket, tending a plant, writing a letter. The guard's flashlight swept across the barracks one last time before lights out. She met his eyes briefly, and he looked away as always, keeping his distance. In that tiny gesture was the entire story of her captivity. She lay down on her bunk, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. She was still a prisoner, still far from home, but the terror that had greeted her arrival was gone. In its place was a strange steadiness, a knowledge that she would leave this camp as herself. She closed her eyes and listened to the wind through the wire. She no longer imagined rifles or punishments waiting at dawn. She imagined instead the sound of waves at home, a train station, her mother's voice.